You meet someone you have never seen before. You hand them something you made. They hand you something back. No words shared, no shared language, maybe. Just an exchange. This happens to you almost every day. A cashier, a delivery driver, a stranger on an app selling you a couch. You trust people you have never met and will likely never see again. This feels modern. It is not. For most of human history, strangers were not trading partners. They were threats. A face you didn't recognize from your own band of 20 or 30 people meant danger, not opportunity. So when did that change? When did your ancestors look at someone outside their group and see, for the first time, a deal instead of a threat? The answer reaches back further than almost anyone expects. And the evidence is sitting in the dirt, in caves, in the chemical signature of stone. Let's start with what trade actually requires. Trust, a way to communicate value. And most importantly, a reason to believe the other person won't just take what you have and disappear. Anthropologist Marcel Mauss, writing in the early 20th century, argued that the earliest exchanges were not simple transactions at all. They were gifts, and gifts came with obligation. If I give you something, you now owe me something back. That debt is what held strangers together long before money, long before contracts, long before anything resembling a market. But obligation alone doesn't explain how the habit started. For that, you have to go back roughly 300,000 years to the early evidence of Homo sapiens in Africa. At a site called Olorgesailie in modern-day Kenya, archaeologists led by Rick Potts found something strange layered into ancient sediment. Obsidian, a sharp volcanic glass perfect for cutting tools. The problem? The nearest source of obsidian was over 25 miles away. Some pieces had traveled even farther, sourced from outcrops scattered across the landscape in multiple directions. This wasn't a single lucky find, it was a pattern, repeated over thousands of years. Now, 25 miles doesn't sound impressive in a car. On foot through unfamiliar territory, with predators, with rival groups, with no roads and no maps, it is a different kind of distance entirely. So how did the obsidian get there? There are two possibilities. Either people walked that far themselves and carried it back, or it passed from hand to hand, group to group, through a long social chain. Most researchers studying the site lean toward the second explanation, because the timing lines up with something else changing in the human brain and the human social world. Around this same period, the climate in East Africa was swinging wildly. Wet seasons, then drought. Forests, then grassland, then forest again. Survival meant your local resources couldn't be trusted to stay reliable. If your water dried up or your prey vanished, you needed somewhere else to go. And that meant you needed relationships outside your immediate group, built before you needed them, not after. This is the foundation researchers call social networking for survival, not networking in the modern sense. Networking in the most literal life or death sense. Here's where it gets specific. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner spent years studying the Jew/Hoansi people of the Kalahari Desert, a hunter-gatherer society whose practices offer a living window into ancient social structures. She documented a system called hxaro. Under hxaro, individuals maintain long-distance gift partnerships with people in other bands, sometimes hundreds of miles away. A partner might give you a string of ostrich eggshell beads today. Months or years later, you give something back. Not immediately. Not as a calculated trade. The delay is the point. Why does the delay matter? Because an immediate even trade just balances accounts and ends the relationship. A delayed return keeps the relationship alive. It says, I trust that you will repay me eventually, and you trust that I will accept whatever you give, whenever you give it. That ongoing uncertainty is the social glue. It forces both sides to stay connected. And those ostrich eggshell beads aren't just jewelry. They are, in a very real sense, a primitive currency. Lightweight, durable, easy to count, easy to carry across vast distances. Wiesner's research suggests hxaro networks helped Kalahari groups survive droughts because a family that lost access to water or game in one area could call on a hxaro partner elsewhere and be welcomed in, fed, sheltered. The beads weren't the point. The relationship was. The beads were just proof that the relationship existed. Now go back to the obsidian at Olorgesailie. The same logic likely applied. A network of relationships, built through exchange, stretching across unfamiliar territory, meant that when your own region failed you, somebody, somewhere, owed you something. The deeper evidence gets even stranger. At Blombos Cave on the South African coast, archaeologists working with Christopher Henshilwood uncovered perforated shell beads dating back roughly 75,000 years. These shells came from species that don't live near the cave. They had to be carried in from elsewhere or exchanged for. Alongside them, researchers found engraved ochre, pieces of red pigment carved with deliberate geometric patterns. Not tools, not food. Symbols. Why does a symbol matter for trade? Because trade with strangers requires more than just physical goods changing hands. It requires shared meaning. If I show up wearing a particular bead pattern and you recognize that pattern as belonging to an allied group, you know not to kill me on sight. You know I might be a trading partner, not a threat. Symbols were, in a very real sense, the earliest form of identification. A passport made of shell. Let's reconstruct what an actual exchange might have looked like 70,000 years ago on the coast of what is now South Africa. Two groups unfamiliar with each other approach across open ground. There is no shared language. There is tension. Someone steps forward holding a string of polished shells dyed with red ochre, patterned in a way the other group has seen before, carried by a relative, a trading partner from a previous generation. The pattern is recognized. The tension drops, just slightly. An offering is made. Something is given in return. Perhaps meat, perhaps stone, perhaps simply safe passage through territory. No words are exchanged. None are needed. The beads have already said everything that needs to be said. This brings us to the counterintuitive part. You might assume that trade required language first, that you'd need words to negotiate, to set terms, to build trust. But the archaeological evidence suggests symbolic exchange may have predated complex spoken negotiation as we'd recognize it. The objects themselves carried the message. Trust was built through reputation, repetition, and recognizable symbols, not through conversation. And the system worked precisely because it didn't rely on a single transaction making perfect sense in the moment. It relied on time, on the assumption that the relationship would outlast any one exchange. Researcher Curtis Marian, who has spent decades studying the South African coastal sites, has argued that this kind of long-distance symbolic and material exchange may have been one of the key behaviors that allowed Homo sapiens to survive a population bottleneck during a brutal glacial period, roughly 195,000 to 123,000 years ago. When local resources collapsed almost everywhere on the continent, the small number of coastal refugees that remained habitable may have stayed connected to each other through exactly this kind of exchange network. Trade, in other words, might not just be an economic behavior. It might be one of the reasons your species is still here at all. Compare that to what came later, once agriculture took hold roughly 12,000 years ago. You might expect trade to have exploded in scale and complexity once humans settled down, built granaries, and started accumulating surplus. In some ways it did. But something was lost too. Settled societies built walls, both literal and social. Strangers became more suspicious, not less, because now there was property to defend, land to protect, surplus to hoard. The open gift-based trust networks of hunter-gatherer life gave way to something more transactional, more guarded, more bounded by group identity. Anthropologists studying the shift note that early farming villages often shifted toward keeping resources within tighter kin and community boundaries, the opposite direction from the sprawling, intercontinental gift networks of the deep hunter-gatherer past. So, in a strange way, your Ice Age ancestors with nothing but stone, shell, and ochre may have trusted distant strangers more freely than early farmers did, thousands of years later. with actual surplus to share. Think about what this means for you right now. Every time you click buy on a website run by a company you've never visited, in a country you've never been to, made by people you will never meet, you are relying on a system of trust between strangers that took your species hundreds of thousands of years to build. The contracts, the currencies, the reviews and ratings, the credit card networks. All of it is just a more elaborate version of a shell bead handed across a fire 75,000 years ago, saying the same thing it always said. I trust you enough to extend this exchange beyond this single moment. You didn't invent trusting strangers, you inherited it. It was forged in droughts and famines, carried across deserts in strings of beads, etched into red ochre by hands that needed allies more than they needed enemies. Every transaction you make today, no matter how small, is a direct descendant of a stranger 70,000 years ago, deciding not to see another stranger as a threat but as a deal. You meet someone you have never seen before. You hand them something you made. They hand you something back. It is the oldest agreement your species ever made, and you are still making it every single day.